Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mailbox for the 18th of July 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, that's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is League of Legends. I've decided it would be a fairly good idea to play some support. In my experience, the lack of support in solo ranked is part of the reason it's so bloody painful, although support is essentially like babysitting when you've got an absolutely terrible bottom laner. Thankfully, this game went fairly well. First email comes in from Knight117 that says, recently an Escapist article featured a piece on a realistic World War I simulator called The Trench. World War I is certainly a period not often explored by modern gaming, owing primarily to a mixture of long boring campaigns and horrific and often pointless meat grinders. Verdun, the battle in which the game is set, was perhaps one of the greatest examples of this. My question is twofold. Firstly, do you think there's a demand for a simulator of a conflict that was so pointlessly bloody, especially when that realism factor might include your avatar limping along because of trench foot? Secondly, and perhaps most crucially, how much realism is too much in a war game? Well, I don't really know if there is too much realism. It really depends on the context and how the game's actually designed. There are games that work well because they are realistic. There are games that work well because they have authenticity, not realism. There are a lot of gamers that ask for realistic games. They say, oh, why can't we have a realistic game? But that's not what they really want. If they wanted a truly realistic game, the chances are they would play it and they'd get horribly frustrated. Players ask for modern shooter experiences that are realistic and then get frustrated when they're given things like armor and the original Operation Flashpoint. It's too hard, they say. So what do they want? What do they want? Battlefield 3? They more often than not actually want Battlefield 3. And that's not a realistic game. It's an authentic game. There's a feeling of authenticity surrounding it. The way that the game sounds, the way that the game looks, the way that the levels are designed, the way that stuff explodes when a rocket hits it. That gives a certain authenticity. It brings you into this war fantasy. But what it doesn't do is throw any of the realistic stuff that make a war pretty damn horrific at you. It's not even a case of being horrific, it's also a case of mindless tedium. Warfighting is not about mowing down hundreds of dudes for the glory of country X. No, in fact, an awful lot of it is extremely tedious stuff, and you wouldn't really want to simulate that in a video game, because video games are about entertainment. World War I seems to be the absolute antithesis of entertainment, especially if you happen to be playing a soldier. Even if you're playing a general, it's somewhat of a tedious affair. You're going to be throwing troops against a defensive line, an irresistible force versus an immovable object over and over again, essentially grinding hundreds of thousands of men into fine paste to gain a couple of miles of land, if that. That doesn't seem all that interesting to me. As a war game, that sounds like a very boring thing to do. From an FPS perspective, that's even worse. Why would you possibly want to play World War I from a first-person shooter perspective? I cannot imagine. You essentially have one of two roles in that particular setup. Either you're the defender, in which case you sit in a trench with shells landing around you for about 3 days, occasionally having to put on your gas mask in case mustard gas shells happen to land in your trenches, and then receiving a charge that came over no man's land, and gunning down the hapless soldiers that happen to be going in your general direction. Or alternatively, of course, you are doing the charging and getting gunned down. This doesn't seem all that interesting. The only other possibility, of course, is that you throw in some aircraft in there. Okay, well, the thing is that those games already exist. There's actually quite a few flight sim games that focus around World War I biplane, triplane era combat. Why? Because that's really the only interesting part of World War I from an entertainment standpoint. But then you've got to think, well, are we really looking for an entertainment spectacle? Or are we looking for something to evoke feeling, to evoke emotion, a sense of realism, gloom, and doom? Possibly. Some people are looking for that. We could make an argument that the recent release of Spec Ops proves that the more hardcore story elements and the horrors of war can actually be a success. Can they? One has to wonder. I don't know how successful Spec Ops has really been. It's had a pretty good critical reception. Gamers seem to like it. They've commented that the cover-based shooting mechanics are not exactly great. They're average at best. But they've said that the story is really good, and that the story's actually made them feel pretty damn horrible in places. There's some very tough choices that are no-win scenarios in that, and the character development throughout the game as the Delta soldiers get further and further into the maw of madness, as it were, and act like it, is exceptional. It's peerless. It's second to none. But here's the thing. Throughout all of that, you still have a very interesting setting. Dubai is a great setting. Why? Because it's essentially the closest we have to Rapture. This was a comparison I heard made on Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and I think it's absolutely valid. Dubai is the mecca of opulence. And as a result, you have actually a huge variety of terrain available to you. You have some stuff that is very, very interesting to look at. You're battling in over-the-top 6-star hotels. You're battling in ruined post-apocalyptic cities, in the desert, on sands, underground. All sorts of really cool stuff is going on. There's a lot to see. Is there a lot to see in World War I? No, there is not. The ground is churned up, but it is grey. There are clouds of soot everywhere. It is an ugly, ugly place. The ugliest place on Earth, as it were. Can you ever turn that into a good game? It's very difficult to say. Certainly not from a first-person perspective. I think that if they're going to do this, and by the looks of it they are, it's going to be called The Trench 1916 by a French developer, then they're going to have to really evoke that sense of horror. And it's not going to be a game that's fun to play. Now, I think that's actually quite important. The reason it's quite important is that gaming does need to move beyond being simply a form of entertainment. You can take television seriously at times. There are very important things said on television. Important events are broadcast and recorded on television. Television is part of our history. It is an important part of our daily life. Whether you watch it or not, you are indirectly affected by it. Gaming, not so much. Gaming is purely a form of entertainment. Has anything important ever been said through the medium of a video game? Arguably not. And yet there is the possibility of that happening if properly developed. With technology that we currently have, it is possible to simulate something that is truly horrific and convey the message of the horrors of war potentially better than any other medium. So something that I've been wanting to see from gaming for a while. As an interactive medium, it has this potential to tell a story better than anything else. And yet it hasn't quite managed to do that yet. It doesn't really seem to understand. I think the problem is, of course, that you have to incorporate gameplay in some way. If we were to look at the flip side of that, Dear Esther, that doesn't have any gameplay in it whatsoever, that failed in telling a story because games must have gameplay. The interactivity must be there. Dear Esther doesn't have any interactivity. It doesn't have any gameplay mechanics or elements. And as a result, it is not as engaging as it could be. Some people found it engaging. Personally, I did not. I think there's a real possibility for this to actually work. But in order for that to happen, the idea of fun must be tossed out the window. And that's a difficult thing to do, isn't it? How do you design a game that is engaging but not fun, per se? Very, very, very difficult to do. I think the closest we've ever got has got to be horror games. They're more often than not fun to play. You don't necessarily play horror games to have fun. You play horror games to be scared for the emotional highs and lows that are brought to you by that. Scaring people is not particularly difficult. Making people feel sad, depressed, oppressed, gloomy, that's far more difficult to do. And more to the point, do people actually want it? Well, it's going to be an interesting experiment. We'll see how it turns out. But World War I is not exactly a great era for gaming. And I don't think it ever will be. It just isn't really a very interesting war. And it's really depressing to say we have to have an interesting war in order to make games about it. War isn't supposed to be interesting, and yet there's far more written about World War II than was ever written about World War I, and far more media created about that war. Why? Because it was a more dynamic war. World War I was nothing more than a war of attrition. This one comes in from Alex. It says, "Hey TB, I've noticed there's been a fair deal of uproar surrounding the newest Assassin's Creed game, simply because it features the American War of Independence as a historical setting. Many of my friends, I live in sunny old England, have decided to boycott the game just because the British are depicted as the antagonists by the marketing material published. I personally believe this is childish and have read that the main character Connor will be neutral and the war will simply serve as an interesting setting. Furthermore, it's a game, not historically accurate. The Assassin's Creed franchise is built around subterfuge and alternate history, and I personally look forward to their rendition of the American War for Independence. What I don't like, being a bit of a patriot, is the straight-up demonstration of the Brits in the latest stream of promotional media. I prefer a more neutral stance on the topic, as Connor will supposedly be neutral, but I can see the marketing potential of the patriotic, expansive market that is America. I'd love to hear your opinion on this." Well, as a British guy, I've got to say man the hell up to anyone that gets really upset about that. I'm sorry, we used to be the nation of stiff upper lip, not cry over everything. When the hell did that happen? When did we become so easily offended, one has to wonder? And also, when do we run away from our past? That's something I really can't get. You know, I can understand when the Americans do that. They do that pretty much all the time. They have a very interesting idea of some history. The whole, we saved your ass in World War II nonsense that keeps coming up over and over again. But generally speaking, the British don't do that. And I'm really surprised that we decided to do it this time around. And more to the point, in 2012? Really? You were not affected by this war in any way, shape, or form. You don't really have the right to be offended. I'm sorry. I just want to point out, we were kind of a bunch of dicks back then, honestly. The imperial age for the British Empire was, of course, a golden age in terms of prosperity, but we did kind of jackboot the entire world, which wasn't a particularly good idea. England was honestly a very warlike country. I'm not sure if you really realize this. And honestly, in the case of America, yeah, we kind of were the oppressors, honestly. Doesn't mean that the Americans acted honorably by any stretch of the imagination. I think we should probably stop believing that wars are generally just and right, but I think this is getting a little bit too political as far as I'm concerned. Let's get back to the idea of video games and being offended over fictional video games. You're pretty stupid if you are. I can maybe understand it if a country was blatantly misrepresented to the point where it could be construed as racist, but do you really think that's going to happen with Assassin's Creed? Really? They have this nice little disclaimer at the start of every game, which essentially says that the development team is a multinational, multicultural development team made of various creeds and religious beliefs, nationalities, and so on and so forth, simply because they're going back in history and they're dealing an awful lot with religious conspiracy, specifically fictional religious conspiracy, and they don't really want to offend people. I guess that's all well and good when we're basing it in Italy, or perhaps in Jerusalem, but what about when we're basing it in America? Is that just a little bit too close to home? I don't see why it would be. I mean, for God's sake, it was hundreds of years ago. I would honestly expect better of gamers. This is the kind of nonsense that we expect from the Daily Mail. This is the kind of nonsense that we expect from 50-something baby boomer generation people that don't understand the medium at all. This is the kind of nonsense that we expect from the sensationalist media. We do not expect it from gamers. Gamers are supposed to realize the difference between fantasy and reality. Gamers are supposed to realize the difference between fiction and non-fiction, the difference between entertainment and a documentary. If this were a documentary portraying the English as bloodthirsty savages and the Americans as high-up mighty liberators that were absolutely morally pure, then yes, I think maybe you'd have a reason to say, oh, this is kind of bad storytelling. I don't think you'd have a reason to be offended. I think you'd just turn around and say, you guys are idiots. You're portraying this in completely the wrong way. Why would you do this? This is a really bad way to do it because it oversimplifies the whole thing. Honestly, I'm really looking forward to Assassin's Creed 3 because I want to see a game that tackles the War of Independence in such a way that it isn't good versus evil. It's not that simple. Not by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually a very complicated war. The amount of people that don't know that the French were heavily involved in it, for instance, boggles my mind. Hell, the American Revolutionary War was one of the primary reasons behind the French Revolution, which most people, again, don't really seem to know. I don't know why they don't pay attention to their bloody history. This kind of bring up an interesting topic, I suppose, the idea of communicating historical fact via obvious alternate history fiction. I wonder how much people really learned from the Assassin's Creed games about the Renaissance era in Italy. It's not intended as a history lesson by any stretch of the imagination, but it's interesting how games can actually spark enthusiasm for this kind of thing. You know, it would be really great if Assassin's Creed 3 came out, showed a genuinely neutral view of the American Revolutionary War, and got a new generation of people very interested in that particular era of history. Think about the number of people that got interested in the Battle of Thermopylae as a result of 300, which is by no means historically accurate, obviously, but that's okay, because then people go and read about the real Battle of Thermopylae. I think games can actually be used in a great way, perhaps more effectively than any other medium. Wow, I'm really soapboxing it up today, aren't I? But you know what, that's how I'm feeling at the moment. I think that gaming is constantly underestimated as a medium that can actually help spark imagination as opposed to repress it. There are all these arguments that kids don't have any imagination these days because they're video games. It's like, no, actually. I think the video games can really spark an interest in particular areas, and history is one of those areas for fairly obvious reasons. Video games can portray history in a really interesting light. Not necessarily a fully truthful light, but it doesn't have to be. Again, you don't have to have the accuracy in order to get people interested in reading more about history. 300 was not historically accurate. Assassin's Creed is not historically accurate. Rome Total War is not historically accurate. And yet you'll find an awful lot of people that get interested. They bring up their Wikipedia page and they start reading and researching about these various eras of history just on a casual basis, just because they feel like it, just because it's fun, just because a game inspired them to do that. We need more games that inspire people to do that. And I think the last thing we need are a bunch of tight-ass, bleeding-heart, crybaby morons that try and repress this kind of thing. We need gaming to move forward, and quite frankly, if people want to cry over it, they should be trampled rather than catered to. Okay, folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. I'll see you next time.
I know the way. Nothing can hold me back.
Double kill.
You must follow. Now I'm angry. I know the way.
An enemy has been slain. An ally has been slain.
You must follow. Nothing can hold me back.
Rampage.
Stampede.
Unstoppable.
I know the way.
Unstoppable.
Stampede. You must follow. Now I'm angry. Stampede. No way. Now I'm angry.
Has destroyed a turret. Dominating.
Nothing can hold me back.